Right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's a Friday evening in DC. The weather is beautiful, yet you decided to be here for this important conversation. So I think we should just by saying thank you to the audience, thank you in advance to the panelists for what will be a thrilling conversation. My name is Dr. Dwayne Kwaysee Wright. I am an assistant professor of higher education administration at the George Washington University, and I have the privilege to welcome you today to this segment of our GW University seminar, which we entitled Intersecting Masculinities. Intersecting Masculinities. What I will do is throughout the event, we'll put the questions in either the chat or another format where you can actually see it, because I can't actually do that right now. But I will say we've already had two events. They've been very successful. Please check out the video for that. And we'll have our last event next Tuesday at 5 p.m., where we will look at the development of Black boys and men. But for now, we're talking about the intersection of masculinity and gender nonconformity. And to do that, I have the great pleasure of turning it over to my good friend, Desmond Goss. Desmond, take us home. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this panel. What to the gender nonconformist is masculinity. Um, our run of show today will be to start. I'll give a real brief overview of contemporary masculinity studies from a sociological perspective. Then I'll ask each panelist to discuss how their work nuances conventional understandings of masculine contexts, practices, identifications, or embodiments through the experiences, the discourses, or the social psychologies of communities that challenge binarized sex, gender, and sexuality systems. Afterwards, I'll ask our panelists to respond to questions from participants, from each other and myself. So if you have any questions, please do enter those into the Q&A feature of Zoom. And then to close, I'll ask each of our panelists to discuss how gender nonconformity can influence the futurity of masculinities in academic scholarship and or sociocultural or socio-political discourses. So I want to start with a brief overview of contemporary masculinity studies, for which I want to credit the work of Raymond Connell. Before the 1970s, masculinity was generally ignored as a course of study in academic spaces. Then in the 1970s and the early 80s, such research starts to be more common, but it's still sort of dominated by outdated sex role theories, by overwrought psychoanalysis, and real crude kinds of social psych that are really generally concerned with measuring and substantiating sex differences, and of course, rarely returning any significant results. But nevertheless, these projects often portrayed men as monolithic and ignored the theoretical and the political importance of the social construction of masculinity. Then in the 1980s and the early 1990s, a kind of modern or contemporary masculinity studies emerges from the influences largely of intersectional feminism and queer and trans studies. And these new projects often focus on specific and local sites of masculinity creation, maintenance, and deconstruction. And broadly, they corrected the oversimplifications of earlier masculinity studies through new contributions for a kind of contemporary study of masculinity. So today we understand a few things that we perhaps didn't have a good grasp on in the past. That masculinity has a universe of possible arrangements based on an intersectional social location, that masculinities are stratified by varying access to advantages and disadvantages generated by structural oppression, that masculinity is a group and institutional phenomenon, not limited to individual attitudes and behaviors, that bodies are sites for the social construction of masculinity, as cultural concepts create expectations about all bodies that influence how our bodies are structured, that masculinities come into existence through an active constructive process of doing gender that is at times sophisticated and intense, that masculinities often entail contradictory attitudes and behavioral expectations, and lastly, that masculinities are not static, but contested and reconstructed, such that even hegemonic masculinity can be transformed. So it's within this context that I've invited our panelists, each an expert in critical gender studies in their respective fields, to offer us some understandings of masculine contexts, practices, identifications, embodiments, etc., interpreted through the experiences, the discourses, the social psychologies of communities that challenge these binarized systems. First, we'll hear from Dr. Coburn. Dr. Katelyn Coburn, they, them, is an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in Lincoln, Nebraska, and a licensed mental health therapist who specializes in LGBTQ plus inclusive therapy and relational, societal, and religious trauma. Their research focuses on intervening in the societal and relational factors that negatively impact the mental health and well-being of non-binary people and LGBTQ plus communities to reduce health disparities. Dr. Coburn has worked with non-binary people in their clinical and research work for the past 9 years and has especially focused on how non-binary people navigate and resist the gender norms and expectations enforced by white supremacy in order to live an embodied affirmation. They are a 2-time recipient of the Family Therapy Section New Professional Paper Award as part of the National Council on Family Relations and are an active member of both NCFR and the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Gossett. Gossett is Associate Director of the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Trans Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to returning to Penn, where they received an MA in History, they were the Racial Justice Postdoctoral Fellow at Columbia Law School from 2021 to 2023, and an Animal Law and Policy Fellow at Harvard Law School from 2022 to 2024. Dr. Gossett has published work in anthologies such as Trapdoor, Transcultural Production, and the Politics of Visibility, and is co-editor with Yale University African American Studies professor Tavia Nyong'o of a forthcoming social text journal special issue on Sylvia Wynter, Culture and Techniques. They are the recipient of a 2024 Creative Capital Andy Warhol Writers Grant. And last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Dr. Zamantakis. Alithia Zamantakis, PhD, is a research assistant professor at the Institute for Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Wellbeing in the Department of Medical Social Sciences. Her research focuses primarily on health equity for Black and Latinx transgender and non-binary individuals, specifically regarding HIV care and gender-affirming care. She is co-chair for the Division of Gender and Sexual Politics, Sexual Behavior, Politics, and Communities of the Society for the Study for Social Problems, council member for the sexuality section of the American Sociological Association, and a member of the board of directors at the Center on Halsted. She is the author of 2 books, Thinking Cis, Cisgender, Heterosexual Men and Queer Women's Roles in Anti-Trans Violence, and Sexuality, Social Justice. Thank you all to our panelists and welcome. With that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Coburn.
Hi, everyone. I'm just really excited to be here to have this really important discussion. And as I was thinking about what I want to share about my work, I had the question come up for myself about the people I work with. I primarily work with non-binary people in therapeutic and research settings. And I just had the question kind of cross my mind, like, would non-binary people even think of themselves as being masculine, or is that a label that's given to them or forced on them as a way of communicating gender? And do they use masculinity as a way to kind of be understood? That's really the question that came up for me, because the people that I work with, and in some of my own personal lived experience, that we might use masculinity as a way to kind of communicate who we are, but it's so much more about an experience of gender that's embodied than it is about upholding any kind of idea of masculinity, I think. And I really want to demonstrate that by sharing one of my research studies and just really centering the voices of the people in this study that participated. And a lot of my work, I really center this idea that Vad Menon really speaks to, that racism is foundational to gender norms, and gender norms are essential to racism. Gender is a racial construct, and race is a gendered construct. I know in my work and what I have learned in my studies that we cannot understand masculinity at all without understanding how white supremacy, the ongoing project of colonialism and colonization, has really enforced what we understand masculinity to be, and how the experience of masculinity is so different across different racial and ethnic experiences, and then how we're perceived is so based in white supremacist ideas of what gender is supposed to look like. And that's what I really want to demonstrate, and the quotes that I'm really sharing with you, because that just really matters. So we have this person saying, I think very much something I've been aware of in my transition is that to be perceived as a masculine girl is far less violent than to be perceived as a feminine guy. It's really unfortunate that that's how society is, and it's all very much rooted in misogyny. It's weird. The more masculine presenting I've been perceived as, and the more aligned I feel in my body with my medical transition, the more comfortable I am being femme, but the less comfortable I am being femme outside. This study was really conducted kind of during the beginning of the pandemic in the US. And so they said when quarantine first started, I was like, oh, wonderful, I don't have to be perceived by cis people anymore. So you just really see so much about the experience of masculinity. There is an embodied experience for a lot of people, but there's also just so directly tied to the perception of masculinity and the safety or the not safety that's rooted in that perception. Then we have another person saying, I know I say this to my partner a lot, but what we always talk about is how you could tell when there's a white queer person walking around, but you cannot tell, or other people like the general public cannot tell, when there's a person of color that's queer, genderqueer. So this idea of existing, it's erased the moment I stepped out of the door, it's erased. No matter what I do, it's erased. So it's the idea of not being seen, like being a person of color, and being queer and non-binary, but also it's been enforced through either the United States regulation of it, through my parents' cultural and religious background. My parents are extremely religious, and although it's coded as an Eastern religion, it's still colonized. And there is a huge aspect of they're all you have, like this immigrant narrative of like the family that you come here with to the United States is all you have. So it's like this immigrant narrative that you have to be conforming. If not, you'll not have family, but also there's religion, culture, and this mix of being in the United States and not being seen. So you're erased in all kinds of ways, and it's out of my control. So they just kind of very much like, I can't talk about a separate identity on its own. They're just very much together, but it results in this erasure and like, you don't matter, I don't think. And in this quote, you just really see that performativity of gender, that embodied sense of like, this is who I am, but that influence of white supremacy, that what in the US society, we so quickly think that gender has to look a certain way. And you see in non-binary communities, people of color, they're walking through the world and they may be holding a non-binary genderqueer identity, but if they're not looking a certain masculine aesthetic, they're not seen as who they really are. They're not perceived in that way. And it doesn't take away from their identity, but there's this experience of even if they're not claiming certain aspects of masculinity, that might be put on them or it might not be put on them. So then it's kind of like, what do you do with that? And how do you just keep finding yourself? And there's just a lot of meaning making that I'm really trying to highlight. Then we have Jomar who's saying, I think also just rooted in learning that history about pre-colonial Philippines without romanticizing it for sure, but just the acknowledgement that an expansive non-binary understanding of gender has existed for centuries, centuries before all these different countries came in to colonize the Philippines, and it's in my blood. It's something that my ancestors have experienced, and that's been truly nice. And we have Willow saying, a lot of gender stereotypes concerning Black people hold us in a non-binary light, I guess. Like Black women are, they're women, but also very much masculinized and seen as holding two gender spaces. Whereas Black men are seen as hyper-masculine, but also sometimes society saying they need to be brought down to a level that is seen as emasculating to men or whatever. So these are all negative things, but I guess trying to reclaim those narratives back from white supremacy is one way that I can conceptualize my gender identity. And so just another representation of there's often this awareness amongst non-binary or gender non-conforming people based on all the identities that they live with of how they are going to be perceived, but that awareness is not their actual identity, but you can't not be aware of the society you're existing in and what people are going to think of you based on that intersection of race, gender, sexuality that really comes out. And what's being perceived is often the aesthetic of masculinity or the aesthetic of femininity. And that just, again, is an experience that non-binary people are navigating day to day. And then in my work, you also really see gender and gender norms and masculinity and patriarchy. They come out in like the activities that we might do and what's coded as masculine or what's coded as feminine. So you have rumor really speaking to this, saying, I do some community organizing and someone was helping me with a bunch of stuff. And they were like, on the day, don't worry about it. I'm available to help carry stuff. And I was like, I'm gay, I carry stuff. It's kind of like more being like, no, just the assumptions kind of make me uncomfortable. I do and enjoy a lot of activities that are typically feminine coded. I do a lot of cooking and baking. When my roommates are here, I cook for everyone. But then it's like when the things I like doing or when the assumptions are made about what I can do are connected to the gender people perceive me as, I'm like immensely uncomfortable right now. Can we not? And so you just really see like masculinity, gender outside of masculinity. It's just this experience of what you like to do and what you like to be. And I think that's where there's a lot of room to create a lot of possibility. And I work in a therapy setting. When I'm working with white non-binary people, I often hear an experience of it's not that they're not acknowledging the privilege they might walk with through the world being white. When they're being perceived or embodying a non-conforming experience of gender, that is often what is seen first. Their whiteness still protects them in a lot of ways. And then I also hear this experience assigned female people at birth, and Thomas Maccabee writes about this, like there's this experience of not wanting to be a white man. And so if you think about white transgender men, that's a whole different experience of having to really navigate masculinity, because what they're saying is they don't want the idea of masculinity that is associated with white men. They don't want to be taking up space in a way that they know will be oppressive, or they don't want to be perceived as like being somebody that's harmful to other people. And they really might not be, but they know that white men in our society are often attributed those characteristics. And so then they're really navigating like, what does it mean to take on masculine aesthetic, masculinity as a white person? This person, Emerson, they really spoke to this a little bit, saying, I really enjoy having a beard in the fall and winter. It's warmer, it's a lot more comfortable, but it's also something that's assumed to be a masculine trait. And so even accepting this thing and saying, yeah, but actually it's queer to me. I'm actually continuing to be queer gender. I'm actually continuing to queer gender by having it. Like have that, throw on some lipstick, wear some fabulous clothes, I'm just queering it all around. And those moments that I'm taking on one of those gender norms that's assumed masculine, I'm trying to queer it in some way. I love it. And it really allows me to affirm myself. I mean, it also puts me more out there, which also, if I have pushback, then I just want to show up even queer, and then I just affirm myself more. It's like a happy little affirmation circle. And that's where the title of this article really came from. And the quote that I'll end with, and this we'll get to talk about more later in this discussion, but essentially, where do we go? Like, what's possible when we really center non-binary experiences of gender? This person spoke to that, saying, I think some of the joy that I experience, how people have also created a community and identity within themselves. So I'm thinking about neuroqueer, and what does that mean for neurodivergent and autistic folks who are queer and see their queerness and disability as enmeshed in this way of you can't separate one from the other. Seeing how other people are experiencing joy and also creativity, it's like I don't have to fit myself into one box or certain boxes. I could say fuck you to all of that and be who I am and be all these things and be one or nothing, and it's just who I am. I don't know how to explain that level of freedom and level of validation that I felt with all of that. It's like I'm finally coming into myself in a way that I wasn't able to when I was younger. So I don't know. I'm getting teary-eyed just thinking about it. And that is where I would end and pass it to our next panelist.
Thank you so much. That was so much of myself in those quotes, and it's so interesting to see that those participants are coming to this interview with these already sort of like really intersectional sort of formations of identity, even if they're trying to sort of parcel them out and substantiate them. But sort of doing this thing, I think we have as academics, we have this, when we do intersectionality, we have this tendency to sort of do it after the fact, like, oh, what does race look like with gender? And even though we, folks like, Gloria Anzaldúa and whoever else have been warning us, like, hey, that class thing is already gendered, that gender thing is already raced before you reach this intersection. I think it's really beautiful to see that. So thank you so much. And we'll turn it over to Dr. Gossett.
Thanks so much for having me. I Actually, I know you asked me earlier, Desmond, if I had any visuals to share, and I think I changed my mind, so I would like to share something, but I can probably just do it from
Yeah, you should be able to.
here.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Sorry, one sec. Okay, so I wanted to kind of open my, whatever contribution I might make to this really urgent and important forum and conversation with an image. It's a photograph of Marlon Riggs speaking at a panel on Black queer nations, Black nations, and it's this kind of moment in time of the 80s and 90s. And when I think of, well, first off, I'm working on a book project about Riggs that is thinking alongside him as a kind of under thought with figure and his relationship to queer cinema, and then situating him within a broader genealogy of Black radicalism and the aesthetics of the Black radical tradition. And so a lot of this work is archival. Riggs's archive was kind of held after his passing by fellow members of his Signifying Works production company, and then transferred relatively recently to Stanford University, where his papers were actually kept like almost according to his own cataloging of them. So he was a very like meticulous historian and thinker, born in Texas, lived in West Germany, and had parents who had kind of federal government jobs, and his father had been in the military, and so that's why they moved there when he was in middle school, and then returned to the States for high school, and spent much of his high school time and pre-college in Georgia during the kind of moment of 68 and the death of King, and kind of described his childhood as sort of plagued by these racial anti-Black antagonisms. So in a very Fanonian sense of him feeling sort of shattered and trapped. And then goes to Harvard for college and finds it, he described it as kind of imprisoning, goes to journalism school in California at Berkeley, and starts to do like these kind of incredible documentaries. The first one was about jazz and its roots in Oakland as his like MFA sort of thesis. And he finds this queer Black community and is enlivened by it and animated by it, and it revitalizes him or awakens him in many different ways, and heals a lot of the kind of traumas that he experienced around heteropatriarchy and whiteness, that he felt caught between both of those for much of his life. And so his kind of aesthetic and critical labor is kind of doing using film as a medium to kind of confront the visual life of anti-Blackness and the afterlife of slavery. And then also thinking about, Black queer masculinity and love, which, can be sort of reduced to a sort of trope. But for Riggs, I think there's a lot of theoretical like intention and vision that goes into his kind of consciousness and this emancipatory politic that he always kind of we're part of his political coordinates, really. So so I'm kind of writing a book about his life and these topics. And he, I think, is like sort of known now for a quote like "Black men loving Black men is a revolutionary act." And I think he had a version of love that was really capacious, that also kind of was a certain sense almost like limitless. And it wasn't just an agape kind of version of love that we might associate with Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community. It was that, but it was also an erotic sense of love and a kind of sensuality that meant like, confronting and dealing with divisions internal to Black community, suturing or trying to, and thinking about, like, to use maybe Denise De Silva's terms, how can we have difference without separation? And how do we confront, anti-queerness, anti-Blackness, anti-transness was the subject that he touched on. So how do we confront these and rethink masculinity in a more, intersectional sense? And so he's a kind of touchstone for me in thinking about a topic around intersectional masculinity. And here's a Faith Ringgold, who's pictured here, made a quilt of him after his passing. And, just thinking about also the work of the Combahee River Collective, their statement, which I've taught a lot as a kind of, sort of early, like foundational, now canonical text in many ways, but like there's an amazing line because their text was a rejoinder to a white feminism that felt like sort of all masculinity was unredeemable and inherently violent. And there was a kind of white feminist line that was anti-trans women in particular. So, very like dismissive of trans femininity. And then the other side of it was with this particular line of thought that Combahee responded to was a kind of separatism. So like a white lesbian separatism that had the idea that, lesbian, cis, and in this case, white women should extricate or almost like excommunicate or exile, self-exile, and create their own community. And Combahee River Collective members wrote a statement kind of really putting pressure and problematizing this kind of notion of essentialism and cultural nationalism, and saying that they thought that any kind of biological predicate for solidarity is like an inherently problematic way to build a politics. So I think that inside the Combahee River Collective's text, not only is it what was later termed intersectionality, and there's a long genealogy, but this line about, how to resist a kind of like version of building community around assigned sex that is inherently transphobic, and then also resisting the idea that like masculinity was reducible to heteropatriarchy. And Combahee River Collective members said, we can't leave Black men and children behind, that Black men are, we might not agree with certain forms of kind of like, messed up versions of masculinity or violent versions of masculinity. But we don't believe that that's inherent to masculinity itself. And Desmond, when you opened, you talked about, oh, I wrote it down here. You said even hegemonic masculinity can be transformed. And I think of intersectional masculinity as part of an abolitionist project. So abolition is not about, canceling or kind of dismissing or disposability. And it's about like, how do we change these conditions that lead to, or the conditions of possibility for something like the prison industrial complex. So, thinking about ending heteropatriarchy and interpersonally, but then also the prison industrial complex, which reproduces it. It's a site of racial heteropatriarchy in the way it like locks up people, and in the way it criminalizes people, and in the way inside prisons, certain violent forms of masculinity are reproduced and taken as a kind of given. So I think of, figures like Riggs, and also, I don't know how I'm doing on time. Oh, great. Okay. I write a lot in conversation with artists, and so this is an image of work by Keon Williams called Unearthing, which I saw performed live at Dixon Place, which was an amazing experience. This was in 2016. And they work a lot with soil. Mary Douglas called, dirt matter out of place. And in this piece, Unearthing, they sourced soil from African burial grounds in New York and kind of inhabit this figure of the griot, but also use flora, fauna, effluvia, and paint and glitter, and sort of become, you might say, more than human with a capital H, given the ways that what Sylvia Wynter called the genre of the human works along racial and gendered axes. So this piece thinks about transformation, like how can we move beyond these constrictures of anti-Blackness and gender, the gender binary, which is colonial and anti-Black. And they kind of perform this, and it's also about using material. So there's like a kind of relationship to the material, to the soil, to the effluvia, to the flora, to the fauna, that is almost like a queer ecology. And I'll just skip to the last piece. This is from the Whitney Biennial, the most recent Whitney Biennial. It's called Ruins of Empire 2, or the Earth Swallows a Master's House. And it's a structure, an edifice that resembles the White House. It's they're very interested in notions of decomposition and ruination, but also the possibility of transformation. So this structure will kind of fall apart. However, inside it, like in other works, there's possibilities for it to be a kind of site of new forms of life, even in its seemingly inhospitable state. So things like cup fungi that grow in soil that is considered like uninhabitable. So they're very interested in how does life persist in Black life, queer life, trans life, persist in seemingly unlivable situations. And so I think that underlying, well, two things. Underlying this theme of ruination is the possibility of transformation, which to me is an abolitionist project. And I'm really interested in how Black contemporary artists activate abolition in their work. And to me, that abolitionist project always entails necessarily interrogating masculinity and, these kind of radical propositions that we can trace to Gambahi, to Riggs, etc., for versions of intersectional masculinity that could take us beyond anti-Black figurations of gender, sexuality. So maybe I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. That was really excellent. I have so many notes. I very much appreciate the opening with Riggs. I can't even explain how much Tongues Untied and Black is Blank 8
Oh,
really
yeah.
informed my understanding of intersectionality. And you know, together with the CRC statement, and thank you for that reminder that the CRC introduced, you know, this problematic of essentializing gender 2 decades before Judith Butler, for example, but almost never get the same amount of credit, right? But yeah, that's really good, and what a time to be thinking about and sort of pontificating on persistence through unlivable conditions, and the reminder to look towards artists and the humanities for ways that we can be more creativity, I think, around that sort of like creating that that livability, I think, to go back to Dr. Coburn's you know, text. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
And last but not least, Dr. Zamantakis.
Yeah, it's hard to follow such a beautiful ending to that presentation, but I will try my best. So um I'm going to speak briefly a bit about masculinities and desire and symbolic violence and the ways in which they're tied up around gender and race and attractions to transgender women in particular. I wanted to start with a headline from The Guardian in June of 2022 that, you know, reads that America is steeped in violence. And Chris Cuomo, the brother of the infamous former governor of New York, titled a piece for News Nation that violence is in the very fabric of America. And a Pennsylvania State University blog site asked, why are we so obsessed with violence in America? And the US is obviously no stranger to violence. This very nation was born through violence and continues to enact violence today. And there are, of course, numerous structural and systemic issues that facilitate this heightened rate of state violence and interpersonal violence. And, you know, for my own work focusing on intimate partner violence, researchers in Latin America found, for example, that greater income inequality increases the likelihood of intimate partner violence. Researchers in the US have pointed to the roles of historic trauma, cultural disruption, boarding schools, and other manifestations of structural oppression as being connected to the high rates of intimate partner violence among Indigenous women. And inequality, a form of violence itself, is also a facilitator of intimate partner violence. And so in this talk, I'm not so focused on violence itself as I am really interested in the connection between cisgender masculinities, desires, symbolic violence, and physical violence against trans women. And I want to start with a scene from Pose, the 2018 to 2021 FX series that explores the house and ball scene in the 80s and 90s in New York City. And in season 2, Electra, the mother of the House of Abundance and later the House of Wintour, as well as her daughters, Lulu, Blanca, and Angel, take a vacation to a Long Island beach house at one of Electra's clients, where Blanca, pictured here on the right, meets a cisgender male lifeguard who saves her as she's drowning in the beach and later asks her to go for a walk with him at night. And she tells the other women pictured here, Electra and Angel and Lulu, that she's going to go on this date. And Electra immediately responds, you know, they don't kill us because they hate us. They kill us because they hate what it means to love us. And that quote, you know, really stuck with me throughout my own work over the past few years. There is a lot of research in psychology examining cisgender individuals' perceptions of trans people that have found cishet men to have more negative attitudes toward trans people, to be less likely to want to form friendships with trans people, and to also find trans people, in particular trans women, you know, just less attractive. Scholars ethnographically analyzing bars that trans women more frequently solicit asked cishet men participants what gender they would choose as their first sexual preference, and no one chose trans women. And those who do seek out sex with trans women have been found to seek trans women because they're perceived as free of intimacy, attachment, and obligation. They're disposable. In an ethnography of a bar where men seek out trans women, Mock and colleagues found that Black trans women were referred to as straight up ghetto hookers or Black guys with dresses and fucking wigs on. All meanwhile, these men were seeking these women out. And many of the staff at this particular bar were even seeking work elsewhere in order to not be associated with Black trans women. Bianchi and colleagues also found transgender sex workers in Colombia to occupy the lowest status in the hierarchy of sex workers, to generate the least amount of revenue, to report more physical and sexual violence. And so a lot of white supremacist, cis heteropatriarchal intersections create intersecting vulnerabilities for trans women of color, and these intersecting vulnerabilities leave trans women of color in precarious positions regarding violence. But what I think this says even more about is the men who seek out trans women and their expressions of masculinities and what masculinities mean to them. And so what I'm going to be talking about is part of a work that I conducted for my dissertation that was later published in a book called Thinking Cis. But I want to pull some quotes from that work to just kind of contextualize and exemplify what it is I'm going to be discussing. So in my work, I asked cisgender heterosexual men, would dating a trans woman change how others see you as a person? And in large, the ways in which they responded was that their openness or not to dating trans women was about how they felt they would be viewed by others for doing so. And so when I asked G, a 38-year-old cishet Black man, whether being with a trans woman would change how he sees himself, he told me, I'm always going to be a heterosexual and I know I'm a man. And G had no desire to be with a trans woman, but felt that he knew himself well enough that he was secure in his identity as a man, even if his desire changed. But then I asked him if dating a trans woman would change how others saw him. And he said they probably would be like, is he a little bit less straight? Is he gay? Is he bi? Because I know I would see them that way, and I would ask those questions. And so for him to be with a trans woman meant that one wasn't truly with a woman. And it also meant something about his own manhood. And while for some that I talked to, it didn't matter how others viewed them, G explains that he would feel bothered if others viewed him as anything other than heterosexual. And he told me it would bother him because I don't want a man coming up to me on the street and being into me and hitting on me and being gay with me, because then I'm going to have to set them straight. And so for G, being symbolically rendered as other than heterosexual meant that he was recognized as a potential date or hookup for gay or bisexual or queer men. And that man's queerness in this instance became an affront to G and his particular understanding of his being. And so G's setting him straight becomes conceptualized as an act of self-defense. And G's worries about being perceived as other than a heterosexual man and experiencing other men hitting on him wasn't only about his sexual orientation, but about his gender as well. He conceptualized dating and or being with a trans woman as an assault on his manhood and his masculinity. And being with a trans woman would mean that others may see him as gay or bisexual, lowering him in a hierarchy of masculinities to what Connell terms subordinate masculinities. And Connell notes that oppression positions homosexual masculinities at the bottom of gender hierarchy among men. And so even if a gay or bisexual man embodies an otherwise hegemonic masculinity, their non-heterosexual identity functionally depreciates their masculinity and manhood. And trans women's embodiment of a pariah femininity is contaminating to cisgender heterosexual men's masculinity, at least in the ways it's perceived. And violence against trans women enables men to then move back up this hierarchy out of a subordinate masculinity. And so while G here stated himself, and he told me he would not commit violence against someone else, he exemplified, exactly what this means, as well as Connell's conceptualization of complicit masculinities. He wouldn't enact the violence, but he continues to receive the benefits of the violence through his allegiance to other cisgender heterosexual men and his willingness to justify their actions. Similar to G, other men I talked to, I'm blanking on the words, repeatedly conflated gayness and transness, which then shaped, what it meant for them to be with a trans woman. So Musatelli, a 24-year-old man that I spoke to, did not conflate gayness and transness, but Henry, a 26-year-old man, felt that people who dated trans women weren't entirely heterosexual. And he wasn't attracted to trans women, and he just kept telling me, I'm just not into that. He wouldn't really say more. And he distinguished, though, between cis-passing and non-passing trans women. And so when I asked him if being with a trans woman in particular would change how others see him, he responded, I don't think so, only because I didn't think, and here he's referring to a picture I showed him, I didn't think she was a trans woman. So no one else would dare to just be like, oh, that's a trans woman. So I don't think it would change or make any difference. I think if it were obvious, it would definitely change my surroundings and who I hang out with and who I associate with. And he went on to say, when I asked him, how things would change for him, that in the ways where people would not want to associate with me, one, because I'm gay, that's already a thing if you're gay. Some people don't want to associate. And then two, the simple fact that she's trans is like, a close friend of his told him, who's homosexual, he told me that there are levels to being gay. You have your gays, and you have your bisexuals, and you have your trans, at the very bottom. And it's almost like, and this is a bad analogy, and it is a bad analogy, but imagine if, like how back in the days when slaves, they knew they were slaves, but most white men, or some white men, fell in love with slaves, even though they were like the bottom. And his analogy, as terrible as it is, equates interracial relationships in the antebellum US with cisgender, transgender relationships in contemporary society, completely erasing, differences between consensual and non-consensual forms of relationships. But dating a trans woman ultimately would symbolically lower him in terms of how others are perceiving him as a man. And while Connell conceptualizes gay men as embodying a subordinate masculinity and places them at the bottom of a hierarchy among men, Henry argued that being in a relationship with a trans woman would result in him being even further beneath gay men in this gender hierarchy. And so to be trans in this equation is to be in excess of gayness. It is to be so gay that it renders one a spectacle, a target, and less than human. And gender, race, sex, and sexual orientation function as regulatory ideals, which come to qualify a body for life within the domain of cultural intelligibility. Regulatory ideals, aren't simply categories that function to identify if someone is Black or Asian American, gay or bisexual, trans or cis. They function to delimit where the human stops and the other begins. And for Henry to be with a trans woman would result in some of the stigma placed on her as a trans woman, sticking, in the words of Goffman, to him. Cis men dating trans women thus become hyper-subordinated within a hierarchy of masculinities. And, in addition here to conflating gayness and transness, Henry conflates enslaved Blackness and transness. And he understands the analogy is flawed, but in his analogy, is found a certain set of circulating symbols, differential conditions of life and death, fungibility, captivity, fugitivity, and gender produced out of the white supremacist enslavement of kidnapped African peoples and the genocide and internment of indigenous peoples, produced gender variant social formations as an excluded caste. And Blackness, transness, and Black transness are objected from that which is human, that which is desirable, that which is lovable in so many of the conversations that I had. And they're surrounded by constellations of risk, violence, and death. And so Henry isn't so much unattracted to transness as he is unattracted to the symbols that hover around transness, which may hover around him and his manhood if he finds himself in a relationship with a trans woman. I spoke to other men as well who, felt that it wasn't only men who would perceive them differently if they were with a trans woman. Henry's fear of potential consequences for being attracted to trans women aren't simply hypothetical. Other people I spoke to spoke of the ways in which men may call them gay and view them as less masculine, or crack jokes about them and their hypothetical partner, or even physically assault or murder a man for being with a trans woman. And such repercussions of dating a trans woman didn't only come from cishet men, but from cishet women. And so Chris, a 46-year-old cis bi Black man, spoke of his experiences being harassed by cishet women and men for being attracted to trans women. In previous relationships with trans women, he had met their friends, but he kept his world separate from their relationship. And he explained why. I hear that every day. I'm gay. I might sit down, a cis woman, to talk to her, and somebody walks past me. Oh, you're gay. You talk to trans. I hear it every day. I walk down the street. I meet a lot of them. I stop and talk to them, ask what their name is. But people who I know, they criticize me. Why are you fucking around with that? And so at the time of our interview, Chris was involved in a program to prevent him from future rearrest. He was living on the streets, and so he spent a lot of time on the streets of downtown Atlanta. And in spending much time on the streets, interacted with others in the area who were in similar situations and would repeatedly have conversations like this. In an editorial follow-up to her work on homophobia, misogyny, and masculinities among young boys in high school, CJ Pascoe writes of a conversation she had with a student who feared that his future son may want to play with dolls. And he explained why. He said, "When I was little, I loved playing with Barbies. My sister, she always told me to put them away. One day she got so fed up, she dragged me outside and shoved Barbies in all my pockets and made me stand there while my friends laughed at me." And so he felt the need to pass on this sort of protection to his child. And while scholarship on masculinities has tended to focus on how cis men police one another's masculinities, it's also important to recognize the role cishet women play in maintaining patriarchy and hegemonic masculinities and femininities. Shippers highlights that it's through social practice that masculinities and femininities are enacted and become hegemonic. And while Chris was the only man I interviewed who intentionally dated trans women, there are obviously many other men in this world who date trans women and who subsequently enact violence against many trans women. A 2019 Vice article detailed the experience of one cishet man whose girlfriend found out he was attracted to cis women and trans women. And so the article explains, at first she cried and interrogated him. Was he gay? Was she just a prop for him to look straight? Why did he hide this from her? Then she got mean. Over the course of a month, Owen said she used his sexuality as a weapon against him. According to Owen, she pitilessly mocked him, remarking on how disappointed he must be that she doesn't have a dick. He obviously wanted to be a bottom. He recalled her saying to get a good fucking. Sometimes when they were intimate, Owen said that she would climb on top of him and mockingly simulate fucking him in the ass. And much like Chris, the man in the previous slide, the man involved in this situation was mocked, chided, and derided for being attracted to trans women. He was assumed to be on the down low, to be using her as a beard, as she viewed trans women as men dressed in women's clothing. And so really, what is at the core of the policing of cishet men's heterosexuality and masculinities isn't simply whether a woman is trans or not, but whether a cis individual being with a trans woman may experience some of the barriers, harassment, and or discrimination that trans people experience in their everyday lives. And the symbols that circulate around sociopolitical conceptualizations of trans women can come to stick to those that love and or have sex with trans women. And violence becomes a way of shedding these symbols, which is a lot of what my work looks like. It looks at, and manhood in particular becomes reshaped and denigrated and penalized within the forms of relationships. I'm not sure how I am on time, so I'm going to move forward, but collectively, the symbolic circuitry surrounding trans women comes to make being with a trans woman undesirable. To be with a trans woman comes to say something about the person with them. And their embodiment of what I and others call a pariah femininity contaminates the relations of masculinities for cisgender heterosexual men who date them, resulting in cishet men feeling emasculated or like they're enduring social punishment. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. so much there. So much care, unfortunately. I think that the importance of, I was thinking a lot about Davidson, who writes about like sex tourism, and thinking about the ways in which for so many cis straight white men in the US and in Europe in particular, that like cis masculinity is existential. And so protecting it becomes a sort of like moral imperative, and in that way the violence becomes not just excusable but necessary. Right, I mean, it's sort of this like necessary sort of mechanism to protect what they understand as like this essential selfhood, which is just, you know, I mean, it produces these terrible situations, but I think it's so important to understand that when we think about what we're doing with this information to try and make worlds more livable for folks, right? And I was also thinking about like Lane Steele and their discussion around Black lesbian studs, and again, the sort of use of violence to sort of denigrate a masculine use of violence by cis lesbian women, to sort of, you know, move themselves, I guess, a little higher on the sort of power ladder by denigrating others. It's just so interesting and problematic, obviously, but so much intrigue. And now thinking about why is that gay white men in the US, when we're clearly under attack as an LGBTQ community, are so at least seem so, you know, okay with being blasé or out, you know, overtly participatory in the exclusion, the violence towards trans folks that we're experiencing right now. So this sort of, I think your research is so important for thinking about the use of violence as sort of like this deployable resource, and how it gets sort of tied to existence for bodies on various levels of power, unfortunately. So thank you so much for that. So we'll open up questions. If any of our attendees have questions, please do use the Q&A feature, and I will ask them to folks. But I wanted to ask first if our panelists had any questions for each other. And then we can get into any questions we have from the panelists. But do you all have any questions that you wanted to pose?
Yeah, I had a question for my two brilliant co-panelists. And it's kind of a methodological or disciplinary question. I'm wondering how you kind of built connections to or relationships to or with the subjects who appear quoted in your work, and how you kind of go about that process and navigate some of the frictions that might come with that too.
Yeah. Thank you, Che. And your work is amazing. So I'm so honored to be on a panel with you, because I've been reading your work for so long. But for myself, so I the work that my talk was based off of is from interviews I conducted in Atlanta in 2018. And to do that, I would literally just walk around actually grocery stores to recruit people for my research in different neighborhoods in order to try to like just reach everyday people who maybe weren't necessarily looking at a flyer or weren't like looking for research on social media. And I ended up meeting a couple men who would take me around actually their neighborhoods. I met this one guy who he went by Iceberg, and Iceberg like would drive around with me in his neighborhood and introduce me to people, which actually was not always the safest. One of the people he introduced me to was a drug dealer in the neighborhood who I interviewed in my car, which was not the best decision I ever made, but it was a decision I made. And that guy actually the entire time wanted to know if I was a trans woman or not, and if I would prove it or not, and if I would have sex with him or not, and wanted to make sure that I knew that he had a gun on him and that he would kill a man trying to be a woman. Um, so developing a relationship with that person was very difficult, because in some ways, I think it's hard when, at least for the things that I studied, I wanted to have this relationship where a person could trust me to tell me all of these horrible things. And so a lot of the time, I'd ask them questions, but I wanted to make sure they didn't feel like I was judging them. So I would smile at them as they told me that they would kill someone, and act, just incredibly curious, rather than like, what the hell are you saying? Um, and um, and so I think, yeah, I don't know. I would be interested to hear your experience, Katelyn, since you do a lot of clinical work as well. Um, but yeah, I think there was just a lot of tension there in terms of, even just these men's that I would interview, their own masculinities and how it was being enacted in those moments, where, for a lot of them, they would try to show me how much of a man they were actually the entire interview, because the entire interview was about sex and relationships, and they're sitting here talking to this woman who they don't even know to be trans. I never told any of them I was trans. And so a lot of times, some of the things they would say was really more for their own like bravado, and their own performance of masculinity, than it was necessarily um, what they would say to others, which I think also, you know, raises certain questions around what they said to me and the ways I read it as well, in terms of, how exaggerating they are in order to sort of show how much of a man they are to a woman. But
Thanks.
And I just want to acknowledge I'm like reeling in the best ways from both of your talks, and just so happy to be here, honored to be here, because it's just such an important conversation. And what I can say briefly about the methods piece of my work, I did use social media to recruit, and I intentionally posted in multiple groups that I would get the racial diversity, and intentionally, like, there's so much research about white people. There's not enough research in general about non-binary people, but what we do have is so centered on white people, which that's what's happening. Not okay. But I just wanted to be really, really intentional. And I think what helped in terms of getting rapport and kind of, I think some of the answers I did essentially, like, I just started every interview by saying, like, hey, I'm non-binary and I want other therapists to be able to work with non-binary people in a way that is affirming, inclusive, good. And I think kind of what Desmond spoke to, like, I intentionally asked the questions just as, like, who are you in all of your identities? And can you talk to me about, like, yes, how gender kind of shows up, but how can you talk to me about how all of your identities come together to inform your experiences? I just really intentionally asked that. I think that's how I got a lot of the responses I got. And I'm really grateful to the people that participated in my study for that.
Thank you for all that. Any other questions from panelists to panelists?
Shay, I don't know how much this is a question as a something I was thinking that I would love more of your thoughts on, but you were talking about Hyun's work, which is so beautiful and powerful. And one of the things you talked about was that they are really interested in this concept of what grows within these uninhabitable places within the dirt. And so um I guess I was just interested in hearing even more from you about, I guess, kind of what that means for masculinities, for like gender nonconformity, and for all of these things that have kind of been floating around throughout this forum, um, and sort of like the ongoing reproduction of future masculinities, I guess, if any of that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. Yeah, I guess I feel like I see Keon's project, alongside, or in this instance, I feel like I'm thinking about it alongside like Sadia Hartman's work or Riley Norton's work in terms of excavation of both kind of structural things like how is gender like construct um formed through slavery, and how does blackness exceed things like cisness. So but then also in terms of these kind of archives of um gendered historicity that aren't always visible. Also my sister Tourmaline's work around the archival, and I think in terms of the futuristic, the future directed part of your question, um, thinking about Sadia's work around critical fabulation, this idea that in the seeming absence of an archive, or in the face of archival violence that presents an archive in ways that are really damaging to subjects, like how can we reconstitute the archive itself? And some of that involves a kind of critical fabulating, piecing together. And I think my sister Tourmaline's work, the way she blurs, documentary and historical form with the speculative. So her work around figures like Mary Jones, for example, or Marsha P. Johnson, always speaks to kind of, sometimes it speaks to like cosmos and cosmology, this kind of sense of futurity, basically. So yeah, those are the things that your question kind of prompts for me. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Desmond, if you don't mind, I have a question.
Yes, please.
First of all, thank you for doing this. Thank God we recorded it because I learned a lot, but I got to go back and sort of digest it. This is not necessarily my field, so I feel a bit overwhelmed. But I know that what was said was, number one, important, and number two was factual. That you were delivering the experiences and the stories of people who do not get a voice a lot within research, even so-called critical research. I have sort of two questions. One is sort of the baseline question we've been asking for the seminar all year. And because of the methods conversation, I wanted to nerd out with a second question as well. So I'll give them both to you. The first question, and what we've been asking all year, is there anything redeemable about masculinity? And for you all, I want to ask it from your own personal perspective and your research perspective. Is there anything redeemable about masculinity for non-binary people that would mean for researchers and for scholars and activists, we should invest reforming it rather than, as Che says, just abolishing it? And I'm not assuming your answer in that, Che, to the question, but that's the question. For non-binary people, is masculinity savable, or should we go through the work of eliminating it and maybe or maybe not replacing it with something else? The methods question is a more simple one, which is what we're seeing right now is an attempted erasure of an entire people. I think we'd be surprised in the United States if we weren't 100% sure that the history of the United States was born on the erasure of an entire people. But it does not make it either right or make it feel good for everyone in the LGBT community, including our trans brothers and sisters. As researchers, as scholars, whose voices do we need to be looking at right now? Many of our participants either have grad students or are grad students. If there are projects that you are like, we need to do this now before it's too late, or data or voices that we need to chronicle as the regime is, running through America right now, who are those voices? who are those projects and what methods would be most effective at bringing to life their stories. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for background noise, but I just want to clarify, like, I'm all for abolishing the gender binary, but I don't want to abolish masculinity or femininity, and I don't find the gender binary in the way that it's enforced. That enforcement to me is like comes with so much violence, and you know, I think there's so much creative work of Black feminism to work against that kind of patriarchy. So yeah, I find masculinity inherently worthy, like as a gender expression, variation, in all its forms. Patriarchy and violent enforcement of masculinity to me is not cool. So and that's something that masculinity studies, especially Black, when I was in college, I took a class, Black Masculinities, like up in the plural. And I think that so much work, even before we had the term kind of masculinity in a critical kind of studies sense, has been about, Richard Wright or James Baldwin or all these, so much of Black studies has been thinking through Black men's subjectivity in really profound artistic, creative, and transformative ways. And I think of Black studies as always having a kind of critical masculinity happening inside it. You know, and so I think that's really like invaluable, and has been a source of pedagogy for me. And I think to me, I see that project as being part of the Black radical horizon and future, and really important to continue. And then to your second question about projects, I'll just plug my sister Tourmaline. She has a book coming out May 20th about Marsha P. Johnson. And it feels urgent, especially in the time of, like, as you said, Professor Wright, this kind of erasure that's happening. And of like the National Park Service, the T falling away. And so, the idea that trans people, worse than like being new, never existed at all. So in the face of that, showing how Black trans figures, historical figures, shaped and made possible emancipatory movements. Yeah.
Yes, yes, all of that is really where my head is at. I mean, the two the things coming to my mind are like, it's about humanizing people. Like this point about like, yeah, there's so much about what's happening is about erasure. So much of the violence is what was spoken to about, it's dehumanizing people. So I personally, I know this is broad, but I'm like, any work that is about humanizing people, I'm just really thinking about our queer and trans elders and the ways that they've survived and the ways that they resisted. And I'm also thinking about our queer and trans youth and the ways that they are creating so much space for themselves, the ways that they are living in the face of extreme violence towards them and taking away, trying the effort to take away their future, essentially, is kind of one way I really see it. So I'm thinking about that, and I mean, I think any method that is just humanizing. So whether that's a quantitative method, I think like to just use the measures that get at the actual experiences of people. And if you're using qualitative, to do some of the work that's been spoken to of like make relationships with people, be in community-based participatory methods, I think are so important from just methods perspective. Like, we need to be working with communities and what's actually going to be sustainable and what is actually listening to people's needs is really where my head is at.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. I was trying to hurry and Google for a quote that I couldn't remember. But I think in terms of the first question around are masculinities redeemable, I wanted to pull up a quote by Leslie Feinberg who said, gender is the poetry each of us makes out of the language we are taught. And I think the beautiful thing about poems is you can always rewrite them, and they're never finished. And so I think, it's the same with gender, it's the same with masculinities, it's the same with femininities. They are what they are because of the world that we are in. And I think the world that we are in is not permanent. It's subject to continual change over centuries of time. And I think masculinities and feminities and whatever is beyond that will continue to evolve over time. And so I think everything is redeemable. I think, ultimately it's about uh, how do we tell a different story out of who we are as people. So, I mean, I think in terms of the second question around the sorts of things that are, urgent to tell in this moment or to look at in this moment, there's obviously so much, to your point around just the loss of things that are being looked at. The institute I work in lost $9 million in funding because of the termination of any funding for LGBT research. And so there's so much, and I think at the same time, there's always so much that's possible and so much that's needed. And, I think when I think about as well, if, this sort of idea of whether masculinities are, whether there's a good masculinity or a bad masculinity, whether to save men or not. I guess what comes most to my mind in this particular moment and over the past few years is Palestine. And I think there are obviously so many Palestinian men who need, um, to not be forgotten in the story of what's happening. There's so much telling of, this is happening to women, this is happening to children, as if Palestinian and Arab men are irredeemable or unworth saving. And so I think I guess I don't have a real clear answer to the second part other than I think more conversations like this, more, sorts of um, things that push at the bounds of what it means to be a man or a masculine or just a gendered person in this world. Yeah.
Thank you all.
Yes, thank you so much. That was really useful, really telling, really powerful, really needed right now. Sorry, I'm laughing. That's my defense mechanism. Just things feel so heavy at times. I think that's just what comes out. So I don't see any questions in the chat. So I think we'll move on to our last topic, which is I wanted to ask each of you all to think about and talk about what you think in terms of how gender nonconformity can influence the futurity of masculinities. That can be in terms of academic scholarship or academic creative works, and or perhaps more significantly, given the time that we're in sociocultural and social political discourses. In other words, like how I think you all have been sort of circling this question throughout your talks, but what can we use in terms of thinking about masculinities from these more intersectional perspectives to make our worlds better? Whether that means in the particular social space that we have the most power, you might argue, in terms of academic spaces, as academics, or whether that's in the broader sense of our politics, our cultures, our discourses, etc. So we'll go down the line again. I'll start with Dr. Coburn and then Dr. Gossett, and then lastly, Dr. Zamantakis.
I spend a lot of my brain space and thinking about what's gender euphoria and what is freedom from the gender binary, as Jay was talking to. Like, I think where there can be a future that is both redeemable and that is expansive and that is just way more humanizing is when we can just try to be at the starting place of not making the assumptions of what masculinity is, not making the expectations of like, this is what it has to look like, this is what it has to be. Not saying to ignore the ways that, as was talked about, like that some violence can come from certain expectations and stereotypes of masculinity, but to lean towards like, yeah, how do we create a future where, as I'm not the first person to say this, the person that comes to my mind is Alok again, like there's as many genders as there are people, there's as many ways of doing gender as there are humans on this planet. And so I think it's just like, how do we create a society and create cultures and create like communities where people just get to be free from those expectations, and then that creates the space to create something that actually feels good and works. And humans are gonna human, we're gonna mess up, we're gonna need a lot of compassion, but we need space. We need some freedom from the expectations of the gender binary, is what I'm thinking about.
Thanks. Your mention of the term gender euphoria makes me think about Frank Wilderson, who kind of writes around writes Afro-pessimist theory, has been a major kind of figure for my interlocutor and figure like for me. And he writes, I think it's in different places, but at least it's definitely in Red, White, and Black, which is this book on cinema, about gratuitous freedom, that in the afterlife of slavery, not just kind of the liberal contract of freedom, which is racial slavery's perpetuation. What's required is this idea of gratuitous freedom, so almost like freedom from freedom itself. So it just makes me think, somehow the euphoria made me think of like gratuity, exorbitance, and kind of how, similar to what you're saying, like how do we create the possibility for the proliferation of different iterations, infinite, of masculinities, femininities, like how does the critique, or like kind of moving past the violence of the gender binary, the way it's enforced, open up possibilities for people's lives to be lived in more fabulous like ways. Yeah, so yeah, thanks.
It's always hard to go last after both of you, but I think to return to another quote by Leslie Feinberg, in Stone Butch Blues, one of the characters says to the fictionalized version of Leslie that you're more than just neither, honey. And I think, gender nonconformity, non-binariness, all of this sort of anything outside of what we conceive of as the gender binary as associated with masculinities, I think shows us that there's so much that can be created, right, out of what isn't even known, right? There isn't necessarily language always to explain how people make sense of themselves within this world, and yet people make that language and they make sense of who they are. I think to go back to that uninhabitableness, this entire nation is meant to be uninhabitable to so many types of people. And yet so many people have found ways to create something new out of it, to make space for themselves and their people and whatever it means to be a human in this country. And so I think, non-binary and gender non-conforming masculinities and just identities really show that there is room, right, for this sort of creation within and beyond a person in a moment in which, maybe there isn't necessarily the sort of what's the word I'm looking for? There isn't this sort of social understanding of exactly who this person is. And yet this person at the same time is creating the possibility of that future social world at the same time. And so um, I think, there's that possibility within all of us, whether we're gender nonconforming or non-binary or not. But I think non-binariness really shows us the possibilities of that.
Thank you all so much. Alithia, you said you didn't want to go last, but you wrapped us up real nice and good. So I appreciate that. We had just one last question from Dr. Queller in the chat. I know we only have about 5 minutes left, but I'll pose it to you all. And if you have any thoughts, just let me know. But Dr. Queller is asking about basically how can we, in this moment at which the right is, in charge largely, how do we reach them? How do we get the sense that get them to have this understanding that we exist and are valid and deserving of rights and love, and to move towards this euphoric sort of state I think that Dr. Coburn has talked about. So do you have any thoughts about that? And I also want to probably offer the alternative of fuck them. So if you want to say, oh, I don't want to reach them at all, I think that's that's fine. I can't disagree with that. But perhaps there is a utility to thinking about ways in which we can build bridges with communities that, at least in the mainstream political orientations, haven't really been bridged. So do you have any thoughts about that in our last few minutes? It's a big question.
I mean, I think there's uh two things that I think in regards to that, right? Like, I think there are some people who you need to say fuck them to, right? Like, there are just some people in some situations where it's not safe for every single type of person to be able to have those conversations. And I think there's also, in terms of, this idea of creating something new, I think so many people understands that the way things are is fucked up, and people make good and bad decisions based off the fucked up situations that they're placed in and the fucked up decisions and choices that they have and are offered. And so I do think, to go back to what I said earlier, I think people are redeemable. I think people can change, and I think people do want change, and many people look in the wrong places for change, and as a result create a lot of harm against other people. And I think at the same time, you know, so much conversation, changing of what it looks like to actually interact as people can ultimately change that. I think a lot about labor unions, for example, as like a place where people do change, like thinking about trans and non-binary people. I know so many trans people who are in unions who work with right-wing people who otherwise, were extremely transphobic, and then they met this person and we're on a picket line with this person and they're like, yes, I don't give a fuck if you're trans. Like, things change, I think, in being together and interacting together and in practice. And so I think that's a lot of what we need is, to not continue to be placed in these silos that, so many people above us who control things continue to create that prevent us from changing things.
Absolutely. Dr. Gossett.
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna kind of echo what was just said about how, working together in solidarity creates a certain kind of alchemy that can change the situation. The question about how do we change the right makes me curious, and I don't know the answer. Or it's like somebody could be a dissertation about like how was the left changed, because the left was transphobic and homophobic, like thinking about the era of the Vietnam War, or but now I think there's been a shift where queerness and transness used to be seen, framed by the left as like counter-revolutionary, right? So that, and then there was a shift inside various leftist coalitional politics to where queerness and transness became seen as like one of the tenets, even though it's precarious, and even though I guess the worst version of that would be like homo nationalism. So like that's not what we want, but like yeah, I guess, you know, it's worth investigating how that happened, maybe as a historical example, to think about this question of the right. But I do think there is a limit to you know, there's an antagonism there, and to what extent does the right to exist as the right need anti-Blackness, need capitalism, need transphobia, need homophobia? So, you know, it wouldn't be maybe like trying to change, like the right wouldn't exist, you know, like something else would exist, or because of the process of unlearning all that stuff, or in the process, I mean, yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great place to end, and thinking about, I think as you all have discussed the requirements for redeemability, sorry, that's my dog, notions about abolitionism, and thinking about the sort of the transformation that's required of particularly cis masculinity, but perhaps masculinities in general, to think about a kind of abolitionism, and not, you know, as Angela Davis says, not just this thing that we deconstruct, but what do we want to create in its image, right? That the abolitionism is fundamentally about recreation, not just destruction. And I think putting this conversation around gender and masculinity in that broader context, as you all have done with your work and with your discussion, is so important right now. And I think Dr. Queller for that question, because it's the perfect sort of context to put that all together, and thinking about moving forward as a sort of political unit. So again, thank you all so much for all of this. I took so many notes, like Dr. Wright. I'm excited to relook at the recording so I can hear it all again. So thank you for bringing all of this knowledge, just all of yourself to this. We appreciate it so much. And thank you all to our attendees. Thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to Dr. Wright for organizing the series. I appreciate all of this, and it's so much I'll be thinking about for a long time. So thank you all, thank you all, thank you all. And please do take care of yourselves and take care of each other.
Thank you, Desmond. This was great.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.